Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. All right, we're going to get to it and dive right in. As far as is the audio still bad, Kishore? Souza, Tadeo. Audio's good? Kishore has the audio. Okay. As far as this chapter goes, without going through chronologically what happened in this chapter, maybe over here, just that way. All right. Without going through it chronologically, thematically, this chapter is about how we should do our duty with a renounced attitude. Doing your duty is yoga, and the renounced attitude then gets you the sannyas. So the chapter starts off with a discussion on yoga and sannyas, and Krishna's conclusion is, don't just be a renunciate. And these categories are broad. We might think yoga and sannyas. Obviously, the word yoga is being used here in a totally different way than the word yoga is being used nowadays in the USA. But yoga here means union, doing your duty, uniting with your duty, participating in the world. Sannyas means to renounce or to cast away or to put down your duties. Those two categories of renunciation and activity are really broad categories that we find to be defining features of human beings and the way they move in this world, certainly within religion. If you look at religious traditions, you've got on one hand monastic priests, they would be the renunciates, and on the other hand you have married priests. They would be the active people who are participating in the world. When you look at most churches, they have one or the other. Islam, no monastics. Only married priests. If you look at, if you want to go into Islam and say the Sufis are part of Islam, and then the fakirs of India who are sort of semi-Muslim / Hindu saints, some of them are celibate. But if you look at mainstream Islam, Sunni and Shia Islam, and even the vast majority of the microcosm of Sufism, they're married. Christianity. Well, on one side you've got Catholicism, all celibate. No such thing as a married priest. You can be a deacon, but you can't actually become a priest. They have 3 levels of ordination, but you can't become a priest. Can't actually take vows as a priest. You can be like a really high class lay person, but you can't actually become a priest and administer the sacrament and things like that. Okay, so then you got Protestant Christianity. And by the way, when we just define these groups, we just nailed 5 billion people in the world. It's the vast majority of the world's population. Protestant Christianity, all married. And when I say Protestant, you know what that means, right? That means everybody after Martin Luther who broke free from the Catholic Church. And it includes Methodists and Baptists and Southern Baptists and Pentecostals and Evangelicals and the Calvary Chapel, every other Christian church you ever heard of. Presbyterians and Lutherans and Episcopalians and also known as the Anglican Church, and just everything in between. Quakers, just you name it, all married. People end up on one side or the other. The Eastern Orthodox Church, the church I was raised in, interestingly, has some monks and has some married priests. But anyway, the Orthodox Church differs from the Catholic Church in this regard. But their numbers are relatively small. Of those 5 billion people I just mentioned, their numbers are very small. A few hundred million, so less than 10%. You following this? And the vast majority of them are married priests. So that's the spirituality of the bulk of the world's population. On one hand, you have like an immanent conception of religion. This worldly. Do something here in this world. Be active. Participate. Show up. Philanthropic. Helping those less fortunate than yourself. And on the other hand, you have go to a monastery or a cave or a mountain or an island or a catacomb and spend your life chanting. In the catacombs beneath Rome, there's thousands of remains of monks, 4,000 remains of monks. And there's a placard in it that says, what you are now, we once were, and what we are now, you will be. And they just spent their lives like well aware of this, memento mori, this like movement, like remembering death at all moments, which was very, very popular in Christendom. I mean, people are living to be 30, so you got to kind of prep for it. There's no real, you're a little kid and all of a sudden you're about to die. And so there's not, and people are dying in wars left and right. So it's a lot more, it makes a lot more sense for people to be renounced and thoughtful because they haven't enough time to be seduced into this idea that you're going to live forever, this functional delusion that most people live with, that they're just going to live forever. When you're 20, you think 40 is old. When you're 30, you think 50 is old. When you're 40, you think 60 is old. When you're 50, you think 70 is old. Everybody's thinking old is a couple of decades after where I am right now. I can only go up to 50 because that's as far as I've gone, These are two very broad categories. I'm going to be in this world. I'm going to participate. I'm going to show up. And if you do that, you get super attached. I'm going to walk away. I'm going to run away. I'm going to let go. I'm going to escape. And if you do that, you don't participate. Immanence, this worldly. Transcendence, that worldly. It even works into our conception of God. The basic Christian idea is that the creation is ex nihilo. It's created from nothing. God created the world from nothing. Therefore, mammon has nothing to do with God. Things of this world, stuff in this world, is actually of the devil. It takes you away from God. The spirit is strong, but the flesh is weak. It's easier to thread a camel through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to go back to God. This kind of hatred of things of this world. That's because the world is seen as being totally divorced from God, and therefore God is merely transcendent beyond this world. And if you look in this world, you won't find God. Then you have the pagan ideal that God is very much present in this world, and then you end up not thinking too much about transcendence. And you just worship like what's present in front of you, and you find a tree or this or that, or your body, and you like jump right in, and you see that God is present within this world. But this balancing act of holding transcendence, which leads people to jihadism and millenarianism and death cults and can't wait for the trial by fire or the deluge or the plagues to separate the wheat from the chaff. Can't wait to to go back to heaven. Almost like a death wish, almost like a nihilism. And on the other hand, you never want to leave. And you're very much in this world, and your spirituality becomes kind of ridiculous, and you have to think you're going to go back to heaven one day, but you really hope it never happens, and you hope it's like the block looks just like your home, and it's a big block party, and Jesus is there, and everybody's young and pretty, and Immanence, transcendence. This world, that world. Married, unmarried. Active, renounced. Philanthropic, escapist. And the truth is there's a benefit to both, and you got to walk and chew gum, and that's what Krishna's arguing for. Part of that argument is that you truly have nothing to do with this world. So how you can be in this world but not of it, like a lotus, which is in the water but totally dry. How that's possible, ontologically speaking, how that's possible. You guys know what ontology is? You can't really be a serious student of mine and not know the word ontology. I just use it too often. So if you don't know what the word ontology means, you got wax in your ears, and there's a problem. Ontology is the branch of philosophy that deals with the fundamental nature of things. For instance, the ontological view of the majority of the world now is quantum physics. That on a quantum level, there are things like bosons and gluons and neutrinos, and then those becomes protons, neutrons, and electrons, and those become atoms and molecules, and those become everything you see around you. And so fundamentally, you break stuff down with a microscope, and that's what's left. The fundamental ontology of the Gita is spirit and matter. Ontology is when you break things down to what they are in their most basic iteration, in their most basic fundamental construction. That's called ontology. The ontology, the worldview, the philosophical idea of what you are that allows you. Did you see how I can explain it without using the word ontology? That's because I know my subject. I can talk to a bunch of grade school kids like y'all, or I can talk to people who know what the word ontology means. You should learn the word ontology. It's an important enough word. Do you get it? Did you know it before?
I looked it up 2 weeks ago.
Did you know it?
I was going to say, maybe breaks down to what is, but I don't know.
That's good. That's good. You're getting in the right direction. We should be able to explain it in Spanish. Ontology is la parte de filosofía, de ciencia, que está tratando de entender qué es en realidad, que es el principio fundamental de todas cosas que pueden ver. Even though I don't speak Spanish very well, I can still say it in Spanish because I know my subject. I can say it in Sanskrit, I can say it in Spanish, in English, complicated, not complicated. You got to know your subject. You have to learn the language of philosophy to appreciate Krishna consciousness and be able to explain it without going super slow. The ontological idea that allows us to be in this world but not of it. See, you can decide to be detached as an atheist. I can't control it. All I can control is my duty I'll find my happiness in doing my duty. Although I do believe that when I die, everything is over and nothing exists but us. But there's a bunch of forces at work, and I can't influence them necessarily. All I can do is do my duty and not worry too much about the results. Does that work as a philosophical position? Yes, it does. As an atheist. Our position is different. The Gita's position is different. It's that you can be detached and truly not become implicated in this world, and truly live like a lotus in water, like a lotus in mud, in this world but not of it. Because you exist beyond this world, and you really never have anything to do with it. Which is why in the metaphor used in the Katha Upanishad, where yoga was first defined, the soul is the passenger in the vehicle, not the driver. The intelligence is the driver, but the soul is seen as distinct from the driver even. You follow? Yeah. Loud.
Is the intelligence considered part of the material world then?
Yes, the intelligence is part of the material world. Absolutely. Yes. And by using your intelligence, you're using a tree to cut down the tree. To use the Upanishad's example. You cut a branch, you fashion it into an axe handle, you put a sharp blade on it, and a tree cuts down the tree. And so by using our intelligence properly to guide our mind and our thoughts, we can extricate ourselves from this world by using the very things the world gives, or as we like to say in English, take out a thorn with a thorn. Before they invented tweezers, you would take out a thorn with a thorn. Does that answer your question? Yeah, the ramifications of that worldview are far-reaching, right? Then what do we have to do with this world? How do we interface with the mind, right? And you got to start to ask these questions. Because really, it's very simple. Consciousness exists and matter exists. To deny consciousness, you have to be conscious. So consciousness exists and matter exists. There's really no way of getting around that. So you either say matter is fundamental and we got to invent consciousness and figure out how matter gave rise to consciousness, or you say consciousness is fundamental and therefore matter evolved from consciousness. Did you follow this? Either way, you have two things which appear to be diametrically opposed, like quantum physics and classical physics, and you got to find a way to show how one gave rise to the other. You could be a pure dualist who believed that both matter as well as spirit were eternal, but everybody's always looking for that grand theory where the simplest explanation. And so usually you get back to where you want to have one thing that's the origin of them all. Our ultimate worldview is that everything is spiritual. And this material world is misconstrued spirit, which is why when we offer food on the altar, it becomes sanctified. It becomes sacralized. That's the transubstantiation in Christendom, where the priest turns the water, the grape juice and the wafer into the body and blood of Christ through transubstantiation. We still running? Were we running before or did we cut out?
Nope.
Okay. All right. Does this make sense? So yes, the ramifications are far-reaching, but ultimately everybody's got to do this. Either conscience came from matter or matter came from conscience. Pick your poison. Pick your first point. Pick your first principle. You guys following this? That, in the beginning of the Gita, in the second chapter, Krishna said, you're not the body, therefore don't be attached. Of course, you could also say, or you can't control everything, so don't be attached. Here we get a little further. You exist beyond this world. You don't actually touch this world. Therefore, you can have a divine life free from the fetters of this world. Do you follow this? You can live free from lust, anger, and greed. That materialism can't give you. Let me give you an example. Imagine if I'm driving on a surface street and I'm heading in the same direction as the 405 freeway. Let's say, for example, that I am on Sand Canyon or Barranca Parkway. That's a good one. Barranca Parkway runs more or less parallel to the 5 and the 405 freeway for a brief period of time in Irvine. If you've heard of it, it's called the Barranca Parkway. Now, if you were driving on the Bronco Parkway and you were unsafe and you didn't mind running red lights and you were driving late at night, you could go 80 miles an hour on the Bronco Parkway. And somebody could be driving on the 405 and you could be driving on Bronco Parkway, you could be up to about 40 miles an hour. 80 miles an hour. You follow? And you could keep up with them. At a certain point, you wouldn't be able to keep up with them. Either because of the lights, or just simply because Bronco Parkway doesn't run that far. And so you can keep pace for a certain amount of time, but not for too far. Atheism can keep pace with spirituality in terms of not being attached to your duty, but it can't keep pace in terms of living a life of divinity, free from lust, anger, and greed, in transcendence and touching God. Does that make sense? Did you follow that or not? Don't agree with it.
I want to hear the explanation. Like, where does atheism fall short? Like, in terms of not leading you toward, or necessarily leading you toward the life of lust. Like, where does that barrier occur? Lust, anger.
I mean, at this point, you should have understood my point fully. I'm worried now because you're not stupid and you didn't understand my point. I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you any more information. I'll just repeat myself. If you're an atheist, you don't believe in anything beyond this world. Therefore, how would you be able to exist beyond this world? You wouldn't. Therefore, atheism may be able to help you live detachedly in this world, but it won't help you truly become free from this world entirely, because an atheist doesn't conceive that you have any existence apart from this world. And so just the basic idea of being an atheist limits you at the outset, like a priori, before we even get into philosophizing. You missed that somehow.
The transcendence to the other world, yeah, I missed that.
Okay.
Just confining it to like lust, greed, anger.
No, you could ultimately be detached from all those things and not care. I use that as part of my definition of transcendence. I also mentioned touching God and all sorts of other things to kind of communicate this life in transcendence. An atheist probably wouldn't be able to be free from lust because they believe that you're inexorably linked to your body, and lust is a biological process. So there's that also. You follow? So if I did want to, I gave a larger definition, and that was just part of it. But if you did take me to task on that smaller definition, that's how I would argue that point. Did you follow that? Did you guys catch that? Did you follow that? Did you follow that? Yeah.
But wouldn't the atheists be happy that they're unable to do that because they're thinking like that's an illogical thing to do?
It's irrelevant for the purpose of this conversation.
Okay.
Most probably they would be. However, could we theorize, and this is where he was going, could we theorize an atheist who realized I have nothing to gain from being attached to this world, therefore I should be totally detached and be like a Zen monk? That was the substratum of his question. It was an unstated premise of his question. So although most atheists would not fit in that category, let's say 99.99999%, there might only be one on planet Earth, it's certainly perfectly reasonable philosophically to conceive of somebody as wanting to be totally free from lust, anger, and greed, although not believing in God, because they've realized they can't control everything, and therefore they live a functionally equivalent life to a monk, although they don't believe in anything in the afterlife. Right? Which is why I gave the larger definition, because I anticipated that before you made the objection. You took a part of what I said, you argued from that, so the easiest answer is to point out that that wasn't my whole definition of transcendence. However, if you did put me into a corner and you asked me to defend that that part of my definition, a life free from lust, anger, and greed, was sound in and of itself, separate from the rest of the sentence, if I had to do that, right? If you made me joust with you on that level, then my response would be that because lust is largely a visceral, biological process which supersedes and goes beyond the mind, and it's just part of our basic physiology, our unconscious physiology, then you couldn't really transcend it. You couldn't really live free from it. It would always be affecting you on some level. As would hunger and thirst and so many other things. Where somebody truly understood they weren't this body, could exist in this world in a body that would apparently be suffering from hunger and thirst. But they wouldn't identify with that because they'd be living in another universe. Like someone who was using a computer to communicate with you and had to use the hardware and software with its inadequacies and limitations, but never really identified with those limitations and lived a life themselves separate from the computer and their ability, like they're emailing you or whatever other modes of communication they were using the computer to communicate with you through. Maybe I'm talking to you through a computer, and it's a computer voice that comes out the other end because the technology is not sufficient to replicate my voice. Or even it is my voice, but it's not really my voice perfectly. You follow? Something's lost in translation. Maybe the fiber optics aren't up to par or whatever. That doesn't change me and my voice and my existence. Whereas for an atheist it does, because they fundamentally are the body. And whatever those unconscious physical processes are, those are you. So you might decide you want to live as free from them as possible, but you wouldn't actually be able to be free from them. Are you guys following this? Did you follow it now? The little debate we had? Okay. These are just real fundamental, basic worldviews where people are like a little more transcendent, a little more immanent, a little more this worldly, a little more that worldly. In an extreme, you're part of a death cult, a suicide cult. You want to like die, you want the world to be flooded. I mean, you want to find this crap, where do you go? Look no further than the New Testament. You'll find all sorts of apocalyptic stuff rolling. The Mayans had that same stuff going on. You know what I mean? There's some Buddhists in Cambodia that drink mercury. And there's been millenarianistic cults right up until the present, with the Heaven's Gate and Waco, Texas, the Branch Davidians and the Jim Jones's followers, and just the list just goes on and on. Usually linked to Christianity. Like a obscure reading of the Book of Revelations. But every religion has these kind of guys. It's just that worldly taken to its absurd conclusion, where no room for this worldly. And then with the pagans, the danger on that side is you become a full sensualist with no concept of any kind of spiritual existence apart from this world. You never look at consciousness in its own right. You always look at consciousness through the opaquing lens of this body. And you never distill consciousness. And you find that all over the place too. You guys following this? So, Krishna makes a point, yoga yes, A and B, not sannyas. Don't renounce this world, but have a renounced attitude. Walk and chew gum, walk that razor's edge, not too far left, not too far right. That worldly, but not so much that you can't function in this world. And then he hits you with the philosophical idea that leads you to really not be in this world, like a powerful idea about the nature of self, which is that we ultimately have nothing to do with this world. And then these verses come into play. I think we're going to go through these verses in detail because they are quite interesting. They're quite interesting. What is epistemology? Theory of knowledge, how we acquire knowledge. Yeah? Anybody else? Yeah.
It's the particular system you have that verifies if you have true statements.
Okay? It's a system for verifying truth claims. Okay? Epistemology is what good evidence looks like. Both of your answers are correct, and they're out of a book. Mine is not out of a book, but mine is functionally more understandable than yours. Epistemology is a theory of knowledge. It's a system for verifying statements. What epistemology really is how you know something's true. Because my mother said it. That's an epistemic statement. I know it's true because my mother said it. How do you know what the temperature is? Because the thermometer told me. Because I did the math. It's how you figure out what is appropriate and good and the best proof for something. That's a functional definition of epistemology. Hermeneutics.
How to read a text.
How to interpret a text. Good. The rules for interpretation. Good. Exegetics. Huh? Exegetics.
Exegesis? Yeah, exegetics?
Yeah.
Isn't it the same as that? How to, like,
No, hermeneutics and exegetics are different. Hermeneutics are the rules for understanding a text, and they, of course, they go far beyond grammar and syntax and context, and you get into culture and so many things. Exegetics is actually interpreting a book for somebody and drawing out the meaning of a book for somebody, especially in a religious format. So obviously, exegetics depends on hermeneutics. You have to have rules for interpretation, but the exegetics is when you draw out the meaning of a text. It's the actual exercise of doing that. You follow? The fields overlap considerably, but they're not one and the same. Does that answer your question? Okay, so these verses are really interesting because they can be interpreted in two really distinct ways. I'm not going to tell you what those two distinct ways are. We're going to play a game. And everything I told you just now is relevant because it's going to help you to probably see the portion of the other way of interpreting that it might have escaped you otherwise. Now I'm going to go through and I'm going to read to you guys a very literal translation that you guys are going to follow along with in your book, chapter 5, text 14. We're going to go through it really literally. And then you guys are going to tell me the two ways these two verses can be interpreted. Okay? All right, here we go. Na kartritvam. Na kartritvam. Na karmani. Nakartritvam, doerness, proprietorship, agency, the act of doing something, the agency of action, the principle of action, the fundamental actionness, actingness. Does that make sense? Tva literally means ness. All right. Not the principle of action, not actions, lokasya, of this world, prabhu srijati. The prabhu does not create. Srijati means he creates. He does not create. The na means he doesn't create. He doesn't create the principle of action. He doesn't create actions in this world. Prabhu means the Lord. Prabhu specifically means God. Prabhu comes from the Sanskrit root bhu, which means existence, and pra, which is a modifier, so it's a suffix and an affix. Prefix, excuse me. Prefix. Affix. Prefix. Same. Yeah. So it's a prefix that makes that like the great existent being. The omnipotent being. The powerful being. The mighty Lord. Does not create actions, nor does he create the principle of action. Na karma palasam yoga. Nor does he create the yoga, the union of action and its fruits. Swabhavam tu pravartate. All this proceeds from nature. All this proceeds from nature. Swabhava, same word, bhu. Swabhava, All this proceeds from innate nature. The omnipotent, the great one, the mighty one, the powerful one, the Lord, does not create agency nor action in this world, nor the union of action and its fruit. It all proceeds from nature. Na adate kasichit papam na chaiva sukritam vibhu. The vibhu is almost exactly the same as prabhu, the mighty one, but it's got a different prefix, v, which indicates expansion. And so this means like, it could literally mean the exact same thing. Like vibhu means power. But here it means the expanding one. It's almost like the omnipresent one. The powerful one, the expanding one. Does not accept anyone's sins or anyone's good deeds. Rather, jantava, those who are born, agyanena avritam jnanam, by ignorance, agyan. Agyan means by the opposite of knowledge. Gya is where you get the word gnosis from. Agyanena, it's in the instrumental case. Agyanena, by ignorance. Avritam, covered. Jnanam, knowledge is covered. Tena, and by that, mukhyanti jantava, people who are born, are bewildered. The Prabhu does not create the principle of action or the union of action with its fruits for anybody. That all happens automatically by nature. The vibhu, the expansive one, does not accept anyone's sins or piety. Pap means sins, and sukrit means piety. Krit means done, su means good, so good things that are done. Doesn't accept any of that. And rather, jantava mukhyanti, people are bewildered because knowledge is covered by ignorance. That is a literal translation of the verses. And I'm being literal and generous, like I'm trying to help you guys understand it. If we just did a word by word, you guys wouldn't be able to make it out. But this is giving you guys some connection of the words. Okay. What are the two broad ways you could interpret this verse? Tadeo. These two verses. What are the two broad ways you could interpret them? Tadeo. Are you going to talk?
I was wondering whether you said today or today.
Tadeo.
One way is that the soul is not acting in the world, is not part of the world, and it has nothing to do with the world, right? So he's not causing any actions, he's completely aloof from everything. But the part that I was thinking is that if God is also not doing any of this, and material nature is alone doing it all, then as per your introduction, an atheistic appraisal of our existence here doesn't explain how actions actually take place.
I'm asking you the two ways the verse could be interpreted. You're bringing up additional problems or some problems you see with the verse that require an explanation. What are the two ways the verse could be interpreted? Please go again.
That either A, the soul doesn't do anything, and it is material nature that is responsible for actions in the world, or B, God is a part of it, and he has a part in the actions that manifests in the world.
That doesn't make sense. The verse is a negative. It's about none of this is done by the vibhu, none of this is done by the prabhu. So we could have nothing to do with it. It could all be God's fault. That would just be one explanation. That wouldn't be two distinct ways in reading the verse. That would be one way of reading the verse. We have nothing to do with it, and God's doing it. You follow? That's one explanation. Who doesn't have something to do with it, and who has something to do with it. That's only one explanation. What's the other explanation? One of the explanations is that this verse is referring to our entire introduction, that the soul really has nothing to do with this world. That the soul really isn't responsible for what happens in this world. That the soul truly stands apart from this world. There may be problems that idea creates, but that's one way of interpreting the verse. What's the other way of interpreting the verse? Yes?
That the soul does act.
No. No. I mean, because the verse is saying it doesn't. So how would you twist from it that we do? Because it says it doesn't. The other way of viewing the verse, let's read Prabhupada's translation. The embodied spirit, master of the city of his body, does not create activities, nor does he induce people to act, nor does he create the fruits of action. All this is enacted by the modes of material nature. That's Tadeo's version, right? The soul has nothing to do with this world, right? Next verse. Nor does the Supreme Lord assume anyone's sinful or pious activities. Embodied beings, however, are bewildered because of the ignorance which covers their real knowledge. What's the other way of interpreting the verse? Verse says. Yeah.
That the soul doesn't control his body harmoniously.
No. Let me read it again. The answer is right here for you. Listen carefully. Nor does the Supreme Lord assume anyone's sinful or pious activities. Embodied beings, however, are bewildered because of the ignorance which covers their real knowledge. What's the other way of interpreting these two verses? Yeah.
So even though we don't have anything to do with the material world, we
No.
still act.
What's the other way of interpreting the verse? You guys don't see it? Yes. No. Because if we don't have anything to do, then would stand to reason a third party was at fault. That's what Tadeo said. A third party was at fault, that third party being God. So simply saying that doesn't actually give me another read of the verse. It's just an accoutrement to the read we already have of the verse. What's the other reading of the verse? The other reading of the verse is that God is the referent. Prabhu means mighty. It means omnipotent. It's a word used for God. I told you this in the beginning. I gave it to you. I told you the word Prabhu is used to mean God. Did I tell you that? I told you it was used to mean Lord. Did I tell you that? I told you the word Vibhu also meant God or Lord. I gave you a full-blown etymological analysis of omnipresent and omnipotent. I said it to you directly. I told you this is what these words mean. What are the two ways of interpreting the verse, Alex?
I'm not following.
Did anybody get that? Or am I just like...
I think, are you saying that the first...
Hold on, stop. He didn't get it. Did anybody get it? What are the two ways of interpreting the verse? One way of interpreting the verse is that the Prabhu and the Vibhu, which are being referred to, the great mighty Lord, is the Lord, is God. The other way of interpreting the verse is that the Prabhu being referred to is the soul. Listen to the verses. God does not create action. God does not create the agency of action. God does not create the union of fruits and action. Rather, it's all done by nature. God does not accept your sinful or pious activities. He's unimplicated. Rather, souls in this world that are born to bodies become bewildered when their knowledge is covered by ignorance. Does that work? Yes. What's the other way of interpreting it? The soul does not everything. Therefore, the dual interpretation depends on how you interpret the word Prabhu and Vibhu in the verse. Do you get it now? You have two verses. They could be interpreted either way, and they read perfectly fine. Which one makes more sense? Why does the soul make more sense?
Because God's talking.
No. I mean, I could talk. Listen to your teacher. Your teacher's talking. Why are you opening your mouth? Am I allowed to talk and refer to myself as a teacher? Absolutely. Do you ever do that? You can listen to your father. I'm talking about myself in the third person. Is that unreasonable? It's totally reasonable. What?
Because we were just talking about the body.
Because we were just talking about the body and the soul. Because the whole chapter has been about the body and the soul. It hasn't been about God. Therefore, to interpret these verses as being about the soul and how the soul has nothing to do with this world, that works. It works perfectly well in context. You follow me, Darshan? Jeez. Hey, you guys got to pay attention. We got 15 minutes left, and we got to get through this. And I'm going to teach you all about exegetics. That's what we're doing right now. We're doing an exegesis of this verse. We become exegetes, doing exegesis, following the rules of exegetics, which leads us to hermeneutics, based on how we interpret the words of the verse. I gave you a lot of knowledge about the words, so you have the ability to do this. I didn't assume you had this ability. I gave it to you. You follow? But you got to pay attention, because we got to get through this in 15 minutes. And this is really interesting, because not often you get a verse in the Gita that can be totally interpreted in two wildly different ways and make perfect sense. And then you look at the things which will make you want to interpret it one way or the other. Which one did Prabhupada use? Both. Prabhupada used the soul for the first one and God for the second one. You see that? See what he did? He split it. And it's actually like brilliant, Prabhupada's translation, because it allows us to count for... Anyway, I'll do Prabhupada at the end if we get time for it. But I need you guys to really pay attention here. You're on point now today? And look at your books. Be looking at your books while I'm talking. Okay? Interpretation number one. Its strength is that we're just talking about the soul and how the soul has nothing to do with the body, so it makes perfect sense that this would come now, right? Problem. Who's responsible for all the problems in the world? Not necessarily. Nature. Who's responsible for nature? God. You know, right? Who's responsible for Adam and Eve falling down? The snake. Not God. Who made the snake? The devil. Who made the devil? God. You follow? If God's the origin of everything and nature's at fault, you follow? Then who's responsible? Nature. Well, nature's just following the law of karma, which we create, but then the verse has no meaning. You understand the problem? It leads you to believe that we have nothing to do with this world, we can get away with anything. And how do you come up with what normative behavior should be? How do you come up with an ethical system? How does it not lead to antinomianism, where you can get away with anything? That's a problem. Right? We got to overcome that, right? And then it indirectly blames God. That's another problem, right? Okay. This is the problem of evil. When discussing philosophy, there's just a few questions that get asked in a million shapes and sizes. This is the problem of evil. What creates the bad stuff that people do? If it wasn't us, it's got to be somebody else. That somebody else eventually becomes God. Turn that fan off for me. There's the second one over. Play with the dial until it goes off. You should just have to turn it one time. It should go off. You follow? Okay, let's go to the second reading. God doesn't create any of this. Any problems with that? We did. Any problems with that reading? Why did we jump to God? We were just talking about the soul and how the soul had nothing to do with this world. How do we just jump to God? How do we jump to the verse being about God? You follow? There's a real change of what we're discussing. Can you overcome that? Sure you can. First, we don't have anything to do with this world. Now God doesn't have anything to do with this world. Which then leads us to another problem, which is, because we didn't have anything to do with this world, is from preceding verses, practically speaking. You follow? So if we don't have anything to do with this world, and God doesn't have anything to do with this world, then who's responsible for this world? Well, it says it right here. Nature is. Well, is nature like a competitor for God? You get into this like hopeless dualism where God didn't create all the evil, the devil did. So now the devil is really another God. Because the devil has independent power, exists on his own, is truly separate from God, and has been around forever. So now the devil becomes another God. What?
So Christianity doesn't make any sense.
Huh?
So Christianity doesn't make any sense.
I have no idea how you made that jump.
There's two gods. Right?
Christianity with it. Oh, I mean, is the devil even a major factor in Christianity? In the Bible? No. The devil is like a later addition. You know, like when you read the New Testament, the devil isn't all over the place. Like if you go to a Protestant, it's like he's teaching a different religion than the religion Jesus taught. However, a version of Christianity that has God and the devil. Whether it makes sense or not, I don't know. But it does end up positing two gods. It's a pure dualistic system. It's problematic. If you think that doesn't work, then it fails. If you can defend it, maybe you're good. You guys seeing it's like there's like thorns all around us. We got to navigate through this. We got to see the interpretations and how we would resolve these problems. You see this? The Vedic literatures don't deal with the problem of evil. Know why? Because they don't believe in evil. They believe in ignorance. And the ignorance isn't really a fundamental part of you. The ignorance covers you. It's not really the real thing. Look at the next verse. Jnanena tutat ajnanam yesham nashitam atmana. When the ignorance is destroyed by knowledge for the self. Tesham, for those people, adityavat jnanam, that knowledge is like the sun. Prakashanti tat param, illuminating the Supreme. The ontology of the Vedas is that everything is by nature spiritual and pure. There is actually no fundamental evil. Evil, as a fundamental category of existence, does not exist. Ignorance exists as an intermediate stage of existence, but there is no fundamental ignorance. Ignorance temporarily covers knowledge, like a cloud might temporarily cover the sun, but there's no actual ignorance that's a fundamental quality of reality. Therefore, knowledge, purity, the self, spirituality is the basic fundamental state of being. And the adulteration of that, which never affects it on a molecular level, is ignorant, which washes over the soul. Like stool in a toilet bowl, which seems like it contaminates the water, but not really, because you pass stool and the rain comes and washes it away into the ocean, and the sun evaporates that ocean water and distills it, and that ocean water becomes the ice pack and becomes the purest mineral water you could ever imagine. You see the difference in the ontology? And it has to be stated, because most of us don't really, it's almost impossible to think like this, because we've been raised with a Judeo-Christian ontology that was spoon-fed to us along with the breast milk or formula we were fed. And we can't even quite naturally break free from it. You guys following this? So, we need a different ontology. The ontology is a pure soul ontology. It's very clear. Ignorance is covered by it. Ignorance covers knowledge. But the knowledge is like the sun. It comes out and just illuminates everything. And the soul never really becomes corrupt. The soul never really becomes evil. Does that mean a child molester isn't truly evil? Yes, it does. Now, certainly the Gita believes in karma. Certainly. And it's just very easy to see. These verses aren't talking about karma. They're talking about how you fundamentally don't have anything to do with karma. So we all know that we are in this world and we're suffering from dualities. There's an ethical system in the Gita. I don't want to have to deal with what do I say? Here we go. I said a life free from lust, anger, and greed, and touching God, and this and that. You got all bent out of shape. Well, could the atheist be free from lust, anger, greed too, or aspire for it? We got into that micro debate. But you queered my hustle and messed me up, and I was on a roll, and you tangented me off to the side, and we had to have a little session on the side that nobody else really even thought of. It might have been interesting for you, but it did detract from the point I was trying to make, and you took me off of my soapbox. You follow? Sometimes you need to be able to just speak your piece. And so Krishna's trying to make what point? That we don't have anything to do with this world. While he's telling us we don't have anything to do with this world, he's not necessarily going to go into all the ways in which we do on some level have something to do with this world, because then he wouldn't be able to make his point really strongly. And sometimes when you're talking to somebody, he'll make one point very strongly. I go, well, what about it? Don't worry about that. Worry about this. Learn how to throw a jab. Well, what about the guy? Don't worry about him throwing the counterpunch. Don't worry about the cross. Don't worry about your footwork. Just do this one thing. That's all you need to do right now. Is that a reasonable thing to do as a teacher? Yes, it is. And so Krishna, in this section of the Gita, is laying out an ontology. And it's reasonable for him not to have to go into how we do actually suffer from karma, how there is an ethical system for how you should behave. Because he spends so much of the rest of the text dealing with what normative behavior is and the principle of karma. You follow? But the Vedic scriptures don't actually believe in evil. Therefore, they don't really deal with the problem of evil. They always view ignorance as an intermediate state of being which is overcome in due course of time by the proper use of free will. It's a real different worldview. So if we want it now, the thing is, then they got an oversight, something which is never really dealt with. They blame swabhava, but what do? Because we really think evil. See, you can just blame nature. It's like not that big of a deal. But for us, it's a big deal. Because when we look at all the bad stuff that goes on in the world, we think real bad stuff is happening, real evil stuff is happening. And that stuff clings to God and becomes a problem if we can't find a way to hang it on our hat. So mixing the problems of Christianity with the Vedic scriptures gives us an easy solution that you can mine from the Vedic text, although it's never actually addressed in a direct, straightforward way because it wasn't a philosophical problem they had to contend with. Just like burning people at the stake wasn't a problem they had to deal with. You know what I'm saying? Just like an eternal hell wasn't a problem they had to deal with. So, the way it looks is, you have free will. You can choose to turn away from God. If you choose to turn away from God, you become covered by ignorance because you're always small and dependent. So you either depend on God directly and you bask in the light, or you depend on God indirectly and you bask in the darkness, which God creates for you so you can exercise your independence. You follow? You were created with a tiny little bit of ignorance so you could choose the bad, because if you were created with full knowledge, you'd never be able to choose the bad, and you effectively wouldn't have free will. So you have just enough ignorance to enable you to be able to choose which way you want to go. If you choose the bad, then you get covered by ignorance. Ultimately, you're being covered by nature, which is ultimately coming from God, but really dancing to the beat of your drum, coming from God, not from God directly. And therefore, you are, in effect, getting what you deserve. You are getting karma, your actions have reactions, and you are lying in the bed of your own making all the time. But you never truly have anything to do with that. And you can always wake up from that dream. And then you wake up and you find you never left the spiritual world, and you've always been a soul, and you've always been with God. And the whole thing was like a dream. And so it has reality, and it's created by you, but you can also wake up from it, and it no longer exists, and it's like a phantasmagoria, which dissipates like the fog dissipates in the sun. For this reason, we have to bounce back and forth between these two inconceivable points, how you're responsible for what happens in this world, and how you ultimately have nothing to do with this world. It's a nuanced worldview. It requires some kind of depth going back and forth and a little pendulum swinging, but it does work. Did you guys follow that? In this way, we can talk about the soul having nothing to do with this world, but still have an ethical system. The soul has nothing to do with this world, but we still get karma. The soul has nothing to do with this world, but ignorance still exists. Similarly, we can talk, and that nature comes from God as a facility. Just like you can give people a rec room, but then what they do in that rec room is their own business. If God didn't give us that, then there wouldn't be any free will. We have to have a place to exercise. If there wasn't any karma, God would actually be unkind, because we'd be able to act without ever learning any lessons. And it's actually like merciful that God gives us some karma. If He gave us karma just for one big long lifetime, then we'd never be able to forget everything, and it would be like a nightmare. And so even our ability to forget and start over again from one lifetime to another becomes a blessing from God. Does Krishna create anything? No, He dances to the beat of our drum and just does it based on us. He's not like forcing us into this world. We're going in this world as well. And therefore the verse can be referring to Krishna or it could be referring to soul. There's benefits to both. And Prabhupada, as an expert translation, starts off with the first one about referring to the soul. But the next one says, the Vibhu doesn't accept anyone's good or bad karma. So then it's more appropriate to translate that one as God. Even though Prabhu and Vibhu are practically speaking synonyms, they are. The second one is He doesn't accept anybody's good or bad karma. And so therefore, that one refers to somebody other than living beings. And then it separates it by saying that God is different because He doesn't accept it, but we do. And we are covered by ignorance and bewildered. And so Prabhupada's translation sort of deftly navigates between these two readings in a way that I never saw from any other commentator on the Gita ever. It's absolutely brilliant. It makes the back half of both verses come to life. I've only got a minute left, so I can't go into it in too much detail, at least for the IGTV people. But we will stay and do it on Facebook and Zoom with you guys for a minute. Thank you so very much.